Welcome back to the Electrical Building Design Show. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about how to learn how to use Revit for electrical design. I'm not going to teach you in this video how to do electrical design in Revit. That's a couple hundred hours worth of videos that you would need to watch. Instead, I want to talk to you about the types of videos and resources you should be searching out in order to learn how to do electrical design. In the show notes, I'll link my current favorite videos and resources. You can use that as the starting point for your research. That way, the show notes are always going to have the most recent pointers to the best content out there. When you are learning Revit as an electrical engineer, there's kind of two main pieces that you need to focus on learning. The first is Revit itself. There's just a core set of functionality that you need to understand about how to use Revit. And then you also need to understand how to do electrical design specifically in Revit. So for the Revit fundamentals, for the Revit basics, you're going to be looking for just generic Revit training resources for that. You don't need anything specific to electrical. You need to understand how projects work, how you arrange views and sheets, how you create families and shared parameters. The specific resources for that are going to change, but those fundamentals, you need to have some place to learn all of that. And that is going to be just any generic Revit training resource that's out there. You do need to consider what kind of depth you want to go into on Revit fundamentals. With AutoCAD, our industry came up with the position of CAD manager. This was the person at a firm who was in charge of maintaining AutoCAD, keeping your plotting and all of your scripts running. Now with Revit, that position has morphed to BIM manager. It's the same idea, but the scope has expanded a little bit, so it's been changed from CAD to BIM to handling everything that's going on in Revit. All firms are going to have someone who is performing the functions of the BIM manager. The size of your company is going to dictate whether that needs to be you or someone else. If you're at a large firm, you most likely have a BIM manager. You can lean on them for a lot of this Revit information. They're going to be in charge of setting up your projects, of your standards, of your families. So you as the electrical engineer don't need to learn quite as much of that stuff. You still need to be able to get around in Revit, but you don't need to go deep into the customization of it and the configuration of it. For a smaller firm, if you only have a handful of people, someone is going to have to take on this role in addition to their engineering duties. In the same way that you have someone who was previously the person in charge of maintaining AutoCAD, that person is now going to have to be maintaining Revit. If you're a one-man firm, that's going to fall on you to be the BIM manager in addition to all of the other hats you have to wear as a one-man firm. There's pros and cons, obviously, from the one-man firm to the small firm to the large firm. So you have to weigh that in terms of what kind of company you want to be a part of. But if you're doing this yourself, in the same way that you had to learn how to do AutoCAD and you had to figure out plotting and all of your configuration, you're going to have to do the same thing with Revit. So if you're going on your own, you're going to have to understand Revit at a deeper level than someone who's working with a larger firm who can leverage the BIM manager that exists for him or her. There are lots of tutorials that exist for learning Revit. The trick for you is going to be pulling out the universal information from Revit that applies to you as an electrical engineer. So just be aware most of the tutorials will probably be focused on architects. And as they get into the architectural portion, you can move on to other resources and trainings or just watch that, but know that a lot of it's not going to be relevant to what you are doing as the electrical engineer. Moving on from Revit basics, then you have to start figuring out how to do electrical design in Revit. Revit thinks about electrical really as part of what they call systems, MEP design. So they lump mechanical, electrical, and plumbing all together. A lot of the training resources you see and find are going to have that same bent. They're going to talk about Revit MEP rather than Revit electrical. In those cases, there's going to usually be a lot on the mechanical and plumbing side and just a little bit on the electrical side. So again, in the same way you have to ignore the architectural stuff on the generic Revit training, you're going to have to ignore and move beyond all the mechanical stuff and find the electrical stuff in the systems trainings. There are more and more resources available that talk specifically about electrical design, so this is becoming less of an issue as time goes on. You'll want to search out and find the tutorials and training specifically talking about electrical rather than generally systems or MEP, if at all possible. When you're looking at trainings on electrical design, you also want to make sure you're looking for one ones that are focused on electrical engineers rather than contractors. And this is going to be looking for information about laying out your devices and doing circuiting and engineering stuff rather than laying out the 3D modeling of your cable trays and your conduits. That's important. You might be called upon to do some of that, but that's a little bit different from just the electrical design portion in Revit. Check out the show notes for pointers to the resources that I have found for learning electrical design for Revit. I'll point you to any videos that we've put together on this channel. I'll probably point you to some other channels as well. There's lots of resources out there, more being created every day. So I'll make sure to update that as more resources become available. As a final thought, you need to be aware when you are doing your electrical training in Revit, you are eventually going to hit a wall where Revit doesn't handle something that you need it to do. It has some pretty big gaps that they do not appear to be in any hurry to fill. And you're going to get to that gap and you're going to expect it to handle that. A good example is something like single line diagrams. You think that would be integrated with the Revit model? It's not. It's going to be a series of workarounds to accommodate the fact that Revit doesn't have a lot of the features that you, as an electrical engineer, need out of a BIM package. When you get to that point, check out our software, ElectroBIM, available at designmaster.biz. We created this add-in specifically to address the features that Revit is missing on the electrical side. So we saw those gaps and we have implemented them in our add-in so that you have something like a single line diagram in Revit. You have voltage drop calculations and fault analysis in Revit. However, we're addressing the edges of what Revit can do. Our rule of thumb is that you need to be doing your panel schedules in Revit before you look at something like ElectroBIM. Once you've gotten to panel schedules in Revit, you are at the edges of what it's going to be able to do for electrical design, and then you're going to be looking for ways to move beyond that. And if you want to have something like that, ElectroBIM is there to fill in the gaps for you.